The blood on Grace Keller's dress had dried to a rusty stain as she huddled in the corner of Silver Creek Station, Wyoming Territory, 1878. Every inch of her body throbbed with pain, evidence of the last beating her husband had delivered before abandoning her at this desolate waypoint with nothing but the clothes on her back and the swelling bruises beneath them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the station windows, highlighting her tear-streaked face and the curious, sometimes hostile glances from strangers who passed through the small building. "Can't stay here, miss?" the station master said gruffly, not for the first time. "Train's gone. Next one ain't for 3 days. This ain't a hotel." Grace pulled her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders, wincing as the fabric brushed against fresh bruises. "Please," she whispered. "I have nowhere to go." The words caught in her throat, humiliation burning as hot as the pain in her ribs. 22 years of life, and this was what remained of it, broken, abandoned, and completely alone in a town she'd never set foot in before today. The station master sighed heavily, glancing out the window at the darkening sky. "Station closes in an hour. Can't have you in here overnight. Rules are rules." Grace closed her eyes, forcing back fresh tears. Thomas had planned this perfectly, bringing her to an unfamiliar town, taking everything, even her wedding ring, before disappearing on the eastbound train. 5 years of marriage had taught her what happened to women with no money, no connections, and no protection in towns like this. The station door creaked open, bringing with it a gust of dust-laden wind and the sound of spurs jingling against wooden floors. Grace kept her eyes down, curling further into herself. Experience had taught her that drawing attention only led to more trouble. "Evenin', Hank," a deep voice drawled. "Any packages come in for the North Star Ranch?" "Nothing today, Cole," the station master replied. "Might be on tomorrow's delivery." Grace felt rather than saw someone's attention shift to her huddled form. The footsteps approached slowly, deliberately, and she tensed, preparing for the worst. "Madam, are you all right?" She didn't look up, keeping her face half hidden by her hair. "I'm fine," she whispered automatically, the lie as familiar as breathing. A tall figure crouched down before her, and Grace caught sight of worn leather boots and denim-clad legs. Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet concerned blue ones beneath the brim of a dusty Stetson. The man's face was weathered and tanned, with several days' growth of beard shadowing a strong jaw. But it was the gentleness in his expression that momentarily stole her breath. "You don't look fine," he said quietly, his gaze taking in her disheveled appearance, the bruises visible on her wrists, the dried blood on her dress. His expression darkened, but his voice remained soft. "What happened?" Before she could answer, the station master interjected. "Her husband left her here. Caught the eastbound train after they had some kind of row. She's been sitting there for hours. I need to close up soon." The stranger's jaw tightened as he studied her face. "What's your name?" "Grace," she whispered, then cleared her throat. "Grace Keller." "I'm Cole Nathans," he said. "I've got a ranch about 10 miles outside of town." She nodded slightly, unsure what to make of this information or why he was bothering with her at all. Cole stood up, his tall frame blocking the last rays of sunlight streaming through the window. He turned to the station master. "Hank, is Martha still running that boarding house on Pine Street?" "Sure is. Doubt she'll take in someone with no money, though." Cole reached into his pocket and pulled out several bills. "Tell Martha I'll cover a week's board and meals." He placed the money on the counter, then turned back to Grace. She stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." For a moment, he said nothing, just studied her with those penetrating blue eyes. Then he crouched down again, close enough that only she could hear his words. "No one will ever hurt you again," he whispered, the promise in his voice sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Not while I'm around." Grace wanted to protest, to tell him she didn't need his charity or his promises. But the sincerity in his face silenced her objections. For the first time since Thomas had dragged her onto the train this morning, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. "Can you stand?" Cole asked, offering his hand. Grace hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers in his calloused palm. His hand was warm and steady as he helped her to her feet. Pain shot through her ribs, and she couldn't suppress a gasp. Cole's expression hardened. "Did he hurt you badly?" "I'll heal," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Let's get you to Martha's. She used to be a nurse during the war. She can help." As they stepped outside, the cool evening air made Grace shiver. Without a word, Cole removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was comforting, and it smelled of horses, leather, and pine clean, honest scents that were nothing like her husband's cologne. Silver Creek's Main Street was winding down for the evening, though the saloon at the far end was just coming to life. Grace kept her head down as Cole led her toward a two-story white clapboard house with a small sign that read Martha's Boarding House Clean Rooms, Honest Rates. "Why are you helping me?" Grace finally asked as they approached the house. Cole was quiet for a moment. "My sister," he said finally. "Her husband was like yours, I reckon. By the time I found out, it was too late." The pain in his voice was raw and real. "I couldn't help her, but I can help you." Before Grace could respond, the door opened to reveal a stout woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes. "Cole Nathans," she said, hands on her hips. "What trouble are you bringing to my doorstep this time?" "Evening, Martha. This is Grace Keller. She needs a place to stay and some medical attention." Martha's shrewd gaze softened as she took in Grace's condition. "Come in, child," she said, gesturing them inside. "Let's get you cleaned up." As they stepped into the warmth of the boarding house, Grace cast one last glance at Cole. "Thank you," she whispered. He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he promised. "Rest easy tonight." As the door closed behind him, Grace allowed Martha to lead her upstairs. For the first time in years, she felt something other than fear when thinking about what tomorrow might bring. Martha's hands were gentle but efficient as she helped Grace bathe and dressed her wounds. The older woman's lips pressed into a thin line at the sight of the bruises mapping Grace's body, but she asked no questions. Simply worked in silence until Grace was clean, her injuries tended, and dressed in a borrowed nightgown. "He did a number on you, girl," Martha finally said as she brushed Grace's long auburn hair. "But I've seen worse heal just fine. The ribs are bruised, not broken. You're lucky." Grace stared at her reflection in the small mirror. Lucky wasn't a word she would have chosen. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I have nothing. No money, no family." Martha's eyes met hers in the mirror. "Silver Creek's a small town, but decent work can be found if you're willing. And Cole Nathans is a good man to have in your corner. I can't depend on his charity." "No," Martha agreed, "but you can accept his help until you're back on your feet. Cole doesn't offer what he doesn't mean to give." That night, in the narrow but clean bed, Grace slept better than she had in years, without fear of being awakened by drunken rage or demanding hands. When morning came, she dressed in clothes Martha had provided, a simple brown skirt and cream blouse that had belonged to a previous boarder who'd left them behind. "Not much, but better than what you arrived in," Martha said pragmatically as she served a breakfast of eggs and biscuits. Grace ate carefully, savoring each bite. Thomas had often withheld food as punishment, and her body had grown accustomed to hunger. "I need to find work," she said between bites. Martha nodded. "Doc Wilson's been looking for help at his office. Nothing fancy, just cleaning and helping with patients." and the mercantile might need an extra hand. I'll ask around. Thank you, Grace said, the words inadequate for the kindness she'd been shown. A knock at the door interrupted them. Martha rose to answer it, and moments later, Cole Nathans stood in the doorway of the dining room. He'd shaved, Grace noticed, and wore a clean shirt beneath his worn leather vest. His hat was in his hands, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Morning, Mrs. Keller," he said. "You're looking better today." Grace touched her cheek self-consciously, aware that the bruise there was still visible despite Martha's ministrations. "Thanks to you and Martha." He shook his head. "Just did what anyone would." "No," she said softly. "They wouldn't." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding born of shared knowledge of how cruel the world could be, and how rare true kindness was. Martha cleared her throat. "Grace was just saying she needs to find work." Cole nodded. "That's partly why I came by. My housekeeper at the ranch, Mrs. Finch, is getting on in years. She could use help with the cooking and cleaning. It's not much, but it's honest work with fair pay." Grace hesitated. A position on a remote ranch with a man she barely knew it went against every instinct for self-preservation she'd developed. And yet, there was something about Cole Nathans that made her want to trust him. "I don't know anything about ranch work," she admitted. "Mrs. Finch will show you what needs doing, and you'd have your own room in the house. Small, but private." Martha interjected. "Cole's ranch is one of the most successful in the territory. It would be a good position." Grace considered her limited options. Staying in town meant risking that Thomas might return, might find her. The ranch offered distance and safety. "When would you need me to start?" she asked. "Whenever you're healed enough to travel. No rush." Grace straightened her shoulders. "I can start today." Cole studied her face. "You sure? Martha says your ribs are pretty bruised up." "I'm stronger than I look," Grace said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. A slow smile spread across Cole's face. "I believe that," he said. "We'll leave after you've finished breakfast." An hour later, Grace sat beside Cole on the wagon seat as they traveled the dusty road leading out of Silver Creek. The morning sun illuminated the vast Wyoming landscape, rolling hills covered in sage and grass, with mountains rising in the distance. Despite her anxiety about what awaited her, Grace couldn't help but feel a sense of freedom as they put distance between her and the town where Thomas had abandoned her. "It's beautiful," she murmured, taking in the expanse of open country. Cole glanced at her, his expression softening. "Most folks just see emptiness. Glad you can see the beauty in it. After 5 years of looking at nothing but city walls and closed doors, this kind of emptiness feels like freedom." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "North Star's just over that ridge," he said, pointing to a distant hill. "It's not fancy, but it's home." As they crested the hill, the ranch came into view. A large 2-story house built of sturdy logs stood surrounded by several outbuildings, corrals, and a large barn. In the distance, cattle grazed on the open range. "You live here alone?" Grace asked, trying to picture the tall cowboy rattling around in the spacious house. "Mrs. Finch has been with me since I started the ranch 8 years ago. And there's a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, got 5 men working for me now." He clicked to the horses, guiding them down the slope toward the ranch. "It's quiet, but never lonely." As they pulled up to the house, the door opened and an older woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes were kind as she studied Grace. "So this is the girl Hank told me about," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. Cole helped Grace down from the wagon, his hands gentle on her waist. "Mrs. Finch, this is Grace Keller." "Grace, this is Mrs. Finch." the best cook in Wyoming Territory and the reason this ranch runs as smoothly as it does." Mrs. Finch snorted at the compliment but extended a work-worn hand to Grace. "Welcome to North Star, Mrs. Keller. Don't you worry about a thing. We'll get you settled in right quick." Grace felt a lump form in her throat at the simple acceptance. "Thank you," she managed. "And it's just Grace now. I don't think I'll be using my husband's name anymore." Mrs. Finch nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Grace it is, then. Come on inside. You look like you could use a cup of tea and something to eat before I show you around." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly comfortable. Polished wood floors were covered with colorful rugs, and sturdy furniture filled the spacious rooms. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, taking the chill off the morning air. "It's lovely," Grace said, genuinely impressed. "Cole's got good taste for a bachelor, Mrs. Finch said with a hint of pride. "Built most of the furniture himself during the winter months." Cole looked slightly embarrassed at this revelation. "Just gives me something to do when the snow's too deep for ranch work." Mrs. Finch showed Grace to a small but pleasant bedroom on the second floor. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt stood beneath a window that overlooked the corral, and a simple dresser and washstand completed the furnishings. "You get settled," the older woman said. "Rest if you need to. We can talk about duties later." When Mrs. Finch had gone, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden changes in her life. Yesterday, she'd been certain she would die either from Thomas's violence or from starvation after he abandoned her. Today, she had shelter, the promise of work, and for the first time in years, no fear of a hand raised against her. She went to the window, watching as Cole spoke with two cowboys by the corral. Even from a distance, there was something compelling about him, a quiet strength that drew the eye. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up toward her window. Grace stepped back quickly, her heart racing inexplicably. The next few days established a rhythm to life at North Star Ranch. Despite her injuries, Grace insisted on earning her keep. Mrs. Finch grudgingly allowed her to help with the lighter household duties, dusting, mending, and assisting with meal preparation for the ranch hands who took their midday and evening meals in the main house. Cole was often absent during the days, riding out with his men to check on cattle or mend fences. But at dinner, he made a point to ask about her day and whether she was comfortable. His consideration was so different from what she'd grown accustomed to that Grace found herself watching for his return each evening, listening for the sound of his spurs in the hallway. A week after her arrival, Grace was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, she saw Cole riding in, his tall form silhouetted against the afternoon sky. He dismounted smoothly and led his horse toward the barn, nodding at Grace as he passed. She returned to her task, only to find him beside her a few minutes later. "You shouldn't be lifting with those ribs," he said, reaching for a wet sheet she was struggling to hang. "They're much better," she protested, but allowed him to help. Together, they hung the remaining laundry, working in companionable silence. "Mrs. Finch says you're a quick learner," Cole said finally. "Says you've been a real help around the house." Grace felt warmth spread through her at the praise. "I like being useful." Cole studied her face. The bruises had begun to fade, revealing high cheekbones and clear green eyes. "You're more than just useful, Grace. You deserve a place where you're valued for who you are, not what you can do." The simple statement struck her deeply. In all her life, Grace couldn't remember anyone seeing her value beyond what service she could provide, first to her father, then to Thomas. "I don't know who I am anymore," she admitted softly. "I've been someone's daughter or someone's wife for so long." Cole reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Then maybe it's time to find out," he said. The touch, brief and innocent as it was, left Grace's skin tingling. She stepped back, suddenly flustered. "I should help Mrs. Finch with dinner," she said, gathering the empty laundry basket. Cole nodded, respecting her retreat. "I've got to check on a sick calf. I'll see you at supper." As Grace hurried back to the house, her heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and that, perhaps, frightened her most of all. The days stretched into weeks, and gradually Grace's body healed. The bruises faded, her ribs stopped aching, and she found herself able to take on more responsibilities around the ranch. Mrs. Finch, despite her gruff exterior, proved to be a patient teacher, showing Grace how to manage the household accounts, preserve food for the coming winter, and deal with the minor injuries and ailments that were common on a working ranch. Cole, true to his word, never pushed or pressed. He was unfailingly kind, but maintained a respectful distance, as if understanding that Grace needed space to heal not just physically but emotionally as well. Still, she often caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression thoughtful and intense. One evening in late September, Grace was sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool air after a warm day, when Cole joined her. He handed her a cup of coffee and settled into the chair beside her. "Sky's clear tonight," he commented. "Might see the northern lights if we're lucky." Grace sipped her coffee, savoring the bitter warmth. "I've never seen them. They're something to behold, like God took a paintbrush to the heavens." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the last light faded from the horizon and stars began to appear, brilliant against the darkening sky. "I got a letter today," Cole said eventually, "from the sheriff in Cheyenne." Grace tensed, her hands tightening around the coffee cup. "Oh, I wrote to him about your situation, asked if there was any legal recourse for a woman in your position." Cole's voice was careful, measured. "He says that abandonment is grounds for divorce in Wyoming territory, especially if there was cruelty involved." Grace stared out into the darkness. Divorce. The word felt foreign, forbidden. "I never considered it possible," she whispered. "You deserve your freedom, Grace, legally as well as physically." She turned to look at him, his features half-shadowed in the porch's dim light. "Why does it matter to you?" Cole was quiet for a long moment. "Because I've watched you these past weeks, seen how you've started to stand straighter, speak your mind more. You're blooming, Grace, now that you're out of his shadow. And I think—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I think you deserve the chance to decide your own future, without his name or his claim hanging over you." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Grace's eyes. "I wouldn't know where to start," she admitted. "The sheriff gave me the name of a lawyer in Cheyenne who handles such cases. Said he's fair and discreet." Cole reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "You don't have to decide anything tonight, just something to consider." Grace took the paper, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me choices instead of making them for me." In the starlight, his smile was gentle. "That's what freedom is, Grace. The right to choose your own path." Later, alone in her room, Grace unfolded the paper. Along with the lawyer's information was a short note in Cole's bold handwriting. "Whatever you decide, you have a place here for as long as you want it." The words brought fresh tears to her eyes. Place. A home. These were things she'd stopped believing she could have. The next morning, Grace found Cole in the barn, saddling his horse for the day's work. "I want to do it," she said without preamble. "I want to file for divorce." Cole straightened, his expression serious. "You're sure?" "Yes. I need to close that chapter completely if I'm ever going to start a new one." He nodded slowly. "Cheyenne's a 3-day ride. I'll have one of the men take you." "I'd like you to come with me," Grace interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. if you can spare the time from the ranch. Something flickered in Cole's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. Of course, he said. We can leave tomorrow if that suits you. Thank you, Grace said. Then, gathering her courage, she added, not just for this, for everything, for seeing me when I was invisible. Cole stepped closer, his eyes intent on hers. You were never invisible, Grace. Just hidden away where no one could see how brightly you shine. The journey to Cheyenne was arduous but not unpleasant. Cole was an attentive traveling companion, ensuring Grace's comfort at every stop and entertaining her with stories of his early days ranching in Wyoming. By the time they reached the territorial capital, Grace felt more at ease in his company than she'd ever felt with another person. Cheyenne was larger and more bustling than Grace had imagined, with broad streets lined with substantial buildings of brick and stone. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, maintained an office on the second floor of a building near the courthouse. He was a serious man with spectacles and a thoughtful manner that put Grace immediately at ease. Abandonment and cruelty, he said, making notes as Grace hesitantly described her marriage. And you have a witness to the state in which you were left? The station master in Silver Creek, Cole supplied. Name's Hank Wilson. And Martha Brooks, who runs the boarding house, saw her injuries. Mr. Harrison nodded. That should be sufficient. Wyoming Territory is progressive when it comes to women's legal rights, Mrs. Keller. The court will likely look favorably on your petition. How long will it take? Grace asked, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I'll file the papers today. Given the circumstances, and if your husband doesn't contest it, the divorce could be granted within a few months. He looked at her over his spectacles. Do you have somewhere safe to stay in the meantime? She's staying at my ranch, Cole said firmly. North Star, outside Silver Creek. Mr. Harrison made another note. Very well. I'll send any correspondence there. And the fee. Cole reached into his pocket for his wallet, but Grace stopped him with a hand on his arm. I'd like to pay for it myself, she said quietly. From her reticule, she withdrew a small cloth bag. I've been saving from my wages, she explained, meeting Cole's surprised gaze. It's important to me to do this on my own. After a moment, Cole nodded, understanding in his eyes. Grace counted out the money for the lawyer's retainer, feeling a surge of pride as she did so. Her money earned by her own hands. Outside the lawyer's office, Cole looked down at her with a new respect. You never cease to surprise me, Grace Keller. She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Soon it will just be Grace again. My family name was Kelly. Grace Kelly, Cole said thoughtfully. It suits you. They spent the night in Cheyenne, in separate rooms at a respectable hotel. The next morning, they began the journey back to North Star, both more relaxed now that the legal proceedings were underway. On their second day of travel, they made camp early beside a small creek. While Cole tended the horses, Grace prepared a simple meal from their provisions. As they ate, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace felt a contentment she hadn't known was possible. Penny for your thoughts, Cole said, noticing her contemplative expression. I was just thinking how strange life is, she replied. A month ago, I thought my life was over. Now, she gestured at the beauty surrounding them. Now I feel like it's just beginning. Cole studied her face in the fading light. You know, when I first saw you at that station, you reminded me of a wounded bird, all broken wings and frightened eyes. But there was something else there too. A spark that hadn't quite gone out. Grace met his gaze steadily. You saved my life that day. No, he said softly. I just offered a hand. You're the one who found the courage to take it, to stand up and walk away from everything you knew. It wasn't courage, Grace admitted. It was desperation. Sometimes they're the same thing. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on their faces. In that moment, with the stars emerging above and the wilderness around them, Grace felt a connection to Cole that transcended gratitude or friendship. It frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. "We should get some rest," Cole said eventually, his voice a touch rougher than usual. "Still got a day's ride ahead of us." Grace nodded, retreating to her bedroll. But sleep was long in coming as she replayed their conversation in her mind, wondering if he had felt the same inexplicable pull she had. Upon their return to North Star, life resumed its rhythm, but with subtle changes. Grace found herself watching for Cole more often, treasuring their conversations, and noticing small details about him, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he handled newborn calves, the quiet competence with which he managed the ranch. October brought cooler weather and the annual cattle drive to the railhead. Cole would be gone for at least 2 weeks, leaving Grace and Mrs. Finch to manage the ranch house. "You look after yourself," he told Grace the morning of his departure, standing by his horse in the pre-dawn light. "And don't let Mrs. Finch work you too hard." "I'll be fine," she assured him. "It's you who should be careful." A smile tugged at his lips. "Worried about me, Grace Kelly?" "Someone has to be," she replied lightly, though her heart beat faster at the warmth in his eyes. Impulsively, she reached up and straightened his bandana. "There," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now you look properly fearsome." Cole caught her hand as she withdrew it, holding it gently in his larger one. "I'll come back to you," he said softly, the promise in his voice making her breath catch. Before she could respond, he released her hand, mounted his horse, and rode out to join the waiting cowboys. Grace watched until they disappeared from view, her hand still tingling from his touch. The days without Cole seemed interminable. Grace threw herself into ranch work, helping Mrs. Finch preserve the last of the garden's harvest and prepare the house for winter. But each night, she found herself on the porch, staring down the road, willing it to bring Cole home. "You've got it bad, girl," Mrs. Finch commented one evening, bringing Grace a shawl against the growing chill. "I don't know what you mean," Grace protested weakly. Mrs. Finch snorted. "I've got eyes in my head. You're sweet on him, and he's just as moonstruck over you. Been that way since he brought you home, though both of you are too stubborn or scared to admit it." Grace stared at the older woman in surprise. "Cole deserves someone whole, someone without my baggage. Honey, we've all got baggage. Some just pack it neater than others." Mrs. Finch settled into the chair beside her. "I've known that boy since he was 22, fresh from Texas with nothing but a dream and that stubborn will of his. Watched him build this place from nothing, through blizzards and droughts and all manner of hardships. Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Grace felt warmth spread through her at the words. "Even if that's true, I'm still married, at least until the divorce is final. Then you wait. But don't throw away something precious because you're afraid you don't deserve it." When Cole finally returned from the cattle drive, it was well after dark. Grace heard the sound of horses and men's voices, and rushed to the porch in time to see the weary cowboys dismounting. Cole looked tired but satisfied as he handed his horse over to one of the hands. Seeing Grace on the porch, he approached, his spurs jingling with each step. In the lantern light, she could see a new scar on his cheek and several days' growth of beard shadowing his jaw. "You're home," she said simply, unable to hide the relief in her voice. "Told you I'd come back," he replied, climbing the steps to stand before her. Without thinking, Grace reached up to touch the fresh scar. "What happened?" "Got thrown during a stampede." "It's nothing." His voice was rough with exhaustion, but his eyes were alert, drinking in the sight of her. "Mrs. Finch saved you some supper." Cole caught her hand as she started to turn toward the door. "Grace," he said softly, "I missed you." The simple admission made her heart swell. "I missed you too," she whispered back. For a charged moment, they stood close together in the porch's dim light. Then Cole released her hand and stepped back. "I should see to the men," he said. "Make sure everyone gets fed." Grace nodded, understanding his responsibilities. "I'll have hot water sent to your room for washing up." As she watched him walk toward the bunkhouse, Grace acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. Somewhere between that first day at the station and now, she'd fallen in love with Cole Nathans. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. Winter came early that year, blanketing North Star Ranch in snow by mid-November. Confined to the house by the weather, Grace and Cole found themselves spending more time together playing chess in the evenings, reading aloud by the fire, or simply talking while she mended and he worked on leather repairs. Grace learned that Cole had left Texas after the death of his parents, determined to build something of his own. He'd worked as a cowhand for several years before saving enough to buy the land that became North Star. The ranch's name came from the night he'd first slept on his own property, when a single bright star had hung directly over what would become the house site. "I took it as a sign," he told her as they sat before the fire one stormy evening, "that this was where I was meant to be." In turn, Grace gradually shared pieces of her own story, her childhood in Missouri, her father's death when she was 18, and her hasty marriage to Thomas Keller, a businessman who had seemed kind and stable until the day after their wedding. "I was so naive," she said, staring into the flames. "I thought marriage meant safety." Cole's hand found hers in the firelight. "It should," he said quietly. "With the right person, it can be." A letter arrived from Mr. Harrison in early December, carried by a rider from town who'd braved the snow. The lawyer reported that the divorce petition had been filed and, given Thomas Keller's failure to respond to notices, would likely be granted by February. February, Grace breathed, reading the letter for the third time. Only 2 more months. Cole, who had been pretending to read a book while she reviewed the correspondence, looked up. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No," she said firmly. "It's just, feels so final, and a bit frightening. I've never been truly on my own before." Setting aside his book, Cole moved to sit beside her on the sofa. "You don't have to be on your own, Grace," he said, his voice low and serious. "Not unless you want to be." Grace's heart raced at his words, at the implication behind them. "What are you saying, Cole?" He took her hands in his blue eyes earnest. "I'm saying that I care for you deeply, that watching you heal and grow stronger these past months has been the greatest privilege of my life. And that if you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly once your divorce is final." Joy surged through Grace, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "You want to court me? Even knowing everything about my past? Your past made you who you are, and that's the woman I've come to love," Cole said simply. "The strongest, bravest, most beautiful soul I've ever known. Love." The word hung between them, precious and fragile. "You love me," Grace whispered, hardly daring to believe. Cole raised one hand to cup her cheek gently. "I do. I think I started falling the moment I saw you in that station, trying so hard to be invisible but shining too brightly to be ignored." A tear slipped down Grace's cheek. "I love you too," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've been so afraid to say it, to even think it." "Don't be afraid," Cole murmured, his thumb brushing away her tear. "Not with me. Never with me." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, reverent, a promise rather than a demand. Grace felt something inside her unfurl, like a flower turning toward the sun. When they finally parted, She felt as if she'd been remade, transformed by the simple, profound act of being truly loved. "I'll wait," Cole promised, his forehead resting against hers. "As long as it takes." Christmas at North Star was a quiet affair, but filled with a warmth Grace had never known. The ranch hands exchanged small gifts, and Mrs. Finch outdid herself with a feast that left everyone groaning with satisfaction. Cole presented Grace with a beautifully carved wooden box for her sewing things, made during the long winter evenings. "It's beautiful," she gasped, running her fingers over the intricate scrollwork. "Open it," he urged. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay a silver pendant in the shape of a star, suspended on a delicate chain. "Cole," she breathed, lifting it carefully. "I had it made in Cheyenne," he explained. "A North Star to guide you home, wherever you may wander." Grace looked up at him, her heart full. "I don't need guidance anymore," she said softly. "I'm already home." As the new year dawned, Grace found herself looking forward with hope instead of dread. February approached, bringing with it the promise of her legal freedom and the chance to embrace fully the love she and Cole shared. They had agreed to wait until the divorce was final before making their relationship public, but in private moments, they allowed themselves the comfort of held hands, shared kisses, and whispered dreams of a future together. In late January, just as it seemed spring might be considering an early arrival, an unexpected visitor arrived at North Star. Grace was in the kitchen with Mrs. Finch, preparing bread dough, when she heard the sound of a carriage approaching. Curious, she went to the window, flour dusting her hands. A hired coach had pulled up in front of the house, and a man was descending from it, straightening his expensive coat. Grace felt the blood drain from her face as she recognized him. "Thomas," she whispered, gripping the windowsill for support. Mrs. Finch hurried to her side. "Your husband." At Grace's numb nod, the older woman's expression hardened. "I'll fetch Cole from the north pasture. You go upstairs and lock your door." But Grace found herself unable to move, transfixed by the sight of the man who had dominated 5 years of her life. He looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in a polished way, with cold eyes that missed nothing. As he approached the house, she saw his gaze sweep over the property with a calculating expression. The front door opened before he could knock, and one of the ranch hands, Jim, who'd been mending tack in the parlor, stood blocking the entrance. "Can I help you?" Jim asked, his hand resting casually near the gun at his hip. "I'm looking for my wife," Thomas replied, his cultured voice carrying clearly to where Grace stood. "Grace Keller. I have reason to believe she's here." "Don't know any Mrs. Keller," Jim said steadily. "You must have the wrong ranch." Thomas's face hardened. "Don't play games with me, Cowboy. I know she's here. The lawyer in Cheyenne was quite forthcoming after I made it worth his while." Grace felt rage replace her fear. Mr. Harrison had betrayed her confidence for money, just as Thomas had always insisted everyone had their price. Before Mrs. Finch could stop her, Grace moved to the door, drawing herself up to her full height. "I'm here, Thomas," she said, stepping into view. "Though I'm surprised you bothered to look for me after abandoning me 4 months ago." Thomas's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, the simple but well-made dress, the healthy flush in her cheeks, the steady gaze that no longer dropped submissively before his. "You've changed," he said flatly. "Yes," Grace agreed. "I have. Get your things. We're leaving." Grace almost laughed at his presumption. "No, Thomas. I'm not going anywhere with you." His face darkened with familiar anger. "You're my wife. You'll do as I say." "Not anymore," Grace said calmly. "I filed for divorce. It will be final in a matter of weeks." Thomas took a step toward her, but Jim moved smoothly between them. "That's close enough, mister. This is a private matter between me and my wife." Thomas snapped. Stay out of it. The lady said she's not going with you, Jim replied evenly. I suggest you get back in that fancy carriage and leave before the boss gets back. He won't be as polite as I'm being. For a tense moment, Thomas seemed to consider his options. Then his gaze shifted past Jim to Grace. You think you can divorce me? No judge will grant it once I contest it. And I will contest it, Grace. I'll tell them how unstable you are, how you've been living here in sin with a rancher. That's enough, came a deep voice from behind Thomas. Cole had arrived, dismounting from his horse in one fluid motion. His expression was carefully neutral, but Grace could see the cold fury in his eyes as he approached. You must be the rancher, Thomas said, looking Cole up and down dismissively. Enjoying my wife's company, are you? Cole ignored the taunt, addressing Grace instead. Are you all right? She nodded, warmed by his concern even in this tense moment. I'm fine. Cole turned to Thomas. Mr. Keller, I presume? Indeed. And you are. Cole Nathans. This is my property you're standing on, and you're upsetting my housekeeper. Thomas's eyebrows rose. Housekeeper? Is that what you're calling it? Cole's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. Mrs. Keller has been employed at North Star Ranch since September. She has her own room in the house, with Mrs. Finch as chaperone. There's been nothing improper. How noble, Thomas sneered. But it changes nothing. She's still my wife, and I've come to take her home. After you beat her and abandoned her at a train station with nothing but the clothes on her back? Cole's controlled tone slipped slightly, revealing the anger beneath. You left her to die, Keller. You don't get to claim her now. Thomas's face flushed. What happens between a man and his wife is no one else's concern. It became my concern the moment I found her bruised and terrified, Cole said, taking a step closer to Thomas. And I made her a promise that day that no one would ever hurt her again. I intend to keep that promise. The two men faced each other, the tension crackling between them. Thomas, though well-dressed and groomed, was no match physically for Cole's weathered strength. He must have realized this, for he took a step back. This isn't over, he warned, his gaze shifting to Grace. I'll see you in court, my dear. And when I'm done, you'll have nothing, not this fantasy of independence. Not your lover boy's protection, nothing. You already took everything I had, Grace replied steadily. And I built a new life without you. You have no power over me anymore, Thomas. For a moment, genuine surprise flashed across his face at her defiance. Then his expression hardened. We'll see about that. He turned and stalked back to the waiting carriage, his rigid posture betraying his rage. As the carriage pulled away, Grace felt her knees weaken. Cole was beside her instantly, his arm supporting her waist. Let's get you inside, he said gently. In the parlor, Grace sank onto the sofa, trembling now that the confrontation was over. Cole knelt before her, taking her hands in his. He found me, she whispered, and he's going to fight the divorce. Then we'll fight back, Cole said firmly. We'll get a different lawyer, a better one. Thomas Keller isn't the only one with resources. Grace looked into his determined face and felt a surge of love so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. I can't ask you to take on my battles. You didn't ask. I'm offering. Cole raised her hand to his lips. Besides, he threatened what's mine. No man does that without consequences. Despite her anxiety, Grace felt a small smile tugging at her lips. Yours, am I? Cole's eyes softened. If you want to be, he said, suddenly vulnerable. Grace, I know this isn't the way I planned to ask, but seeing him here, realizing I could have lost you, I don't want to waste another day. He shifted to one knee, still holding her hands. I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day, When you looked at me with those brave, wounded eyes, I want to spend my life with you, protecting you, cherishing you, building something beautiful together. He took a deep breath. Will you marry me once you're free? Tears filled Grace's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. Yes, she whispered. Oh, Cole, yes. He gathered her into his arms then, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And for the first time in her life, Grace truly believed she was. The battle for Grace's divorce proved to be both shorter and more decisive than Thomas had threatened. Armed with statements from Hank Wilson, Martha Brooks, and Dr. Wilson, who had examined Grace's injuries upon her first arrival in Silver Creek, the new lawyer Cole engaged presented a compelling case of abandonment and cruelty. Thomas, it seemed, had overplayed his hand. His attempt to bribe officials backfired when the judge, a stern, principled man with no tolerance for corruption, learned of it. By early March, Grace received word that her divorce had been granted, with Thomas ordered to pay a settlement that, while modest, represented more money than Grace had ever had to call her own. It's over, she breathed, reading the official document. I'm free. Cole, who had been anxiously awaiting the news, swept her into his arms and spun her around the parlor. Free to become Mrs. Nathans, he said, grinning down at her. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Silver Creek Church, with Martha, Mrs. Finch, and all the ranch hands in attendance. Grace wore a dress of pale blue silk that Cole had ordered from Cheyenne, with the silver star pendant nestled at her throat. As they exchanged vows, Grace looked into Cole's eyes and saw the future she'd stopped believing was possible, one filled with love, respect, and the kind of partnership she'd always dreamed of. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister declared, and as Cole's lips met hers in their first kiss as a married couple, Grace felt the last shadows of her past finally fade away. The years that followed were not without challenges. The harsh Wyoming winters, droughts that threatened the cattle, and the everyday struggles of ranch life tested them both. But they faced each difficulty together, their bond growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. A year after their wedding, Grace gave birth to their first child, a son they named James, after Cole's father. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, her auburn curls and green eyes a mirror of Grace's own. They named her Sarah, after Cole's sister who hadn't survived her own abusive marriage. North Star Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Cole's knowledge of cattle and land management combined with Grace's shrewd head for business turned the operation into one of the most successful in the territory. When Wyoming became a state in 1890, granting women full voting rights, Grace was among the first at the polls, proudly casting her ballot with Cole at her side. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Cole surprised Grace with a special gift: the deed to the small house adjacent to their property, converted into a shelter for women fleeing situations like the one Grace had escaped. With Martha Brooks installed as its manager, the Safe Harbor Home, as they called it, became Grace's passion, a way to extend to others the lifeline that had been offered to her. You're remarkable, you know that? Cole told her as they stood on their porch one evening, watching their children play in the yard. Look at all you've built from the ashes of what he tried to destroy. Grace leaned against him, content in the circle of his arms. We built it together, she corrected him. I couldn't have done any of it without you. Cole pressed a kiss to her temple. Yes, you could have. You're the strongest person I know, Grace Nathans. She turned in his embrace to face him. Perhaps, but I'm grateful I didn't have to. Standing on tiptoe, she kissed him softly. Thank you for keeping your promise. Which one? He asked, smiling down at her. That no one would ever hurt me again, she replied. Cole's expression grew serious as he cradled her face in his hands. That's one promise I'll keep until my dying day, he whispered. And beyond if I can manage it. As the sun set over North Star Ranch, painting the sky in the same colors that had welcomed them home on that fateful journey from Cheyenne. Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety, but the kind of love that transforms, heals, and endures through all of life's seasons. From the broken woman huddled in a train station to the confident wife, mother, and advocate she'd become, it was a journey she wouldn't trade for all the safety in the world. In Cole's whispered promise all those years ago, she had found not just protection, but the courage to protect herself and others. And in that, perhaps, was the greatest love story of all.